Hi, everybody. This is Chloe Hudson with World Peace Projects. Thank you for joining me. Today, I would like to talk about the different points of view that are on offer, which can assist us to detach and observe in effort to come to a more efficient and holistic conclusion around a situation or relationship. Also being able to identify and discover different mechanisms of protection that we may be utilizing, though we're not aware of these mechanisms of protection because we might be over-identifying with them. So the reason this is coming up for me is because I'm having several different clients approaching with their level of shadow work, and because they're, overly invested, they're not able to be objective in their situations because, after all, the emotions are heavy, they're dense. It's difficult to step outside of self when we're having such a personal experience. I'm recognizing that because they're over-identifying and owning these emotions and these experiences as them, they're not able to detach and take another point of view to see how the emotions, the thoughts, the belief systems themselves are a mechanism of protection that are a wonderful thing to begin to identify, because when you understand the mechanism of protection, you have the key to unlock the castle. So the first time I had an extremely adulting, revelatory shift in my point of view, which helped me to change my life completely, was in my mid-20s, and I was licking my wounds and trying to heal my battle scars from getting out of an extremely tumultuous relationship with a psychopath. And at the time, I couldn't bring closure to a lot of different situations and feelings because I couldn't wrap my mind around, I couldn't fathom how somebody could say those things or do those things or be that way. It just was completely nonsensical to me. And I found a book which really saved my bacon. It was called Women Who Love Psychopaths. And this book was written by a psychologist who had specified and done many case studies with intimate relationships. The one partner was always a sociopath or a psychopath, and the other partner was always a very empathic person. And most of these case studies were a male sociopath, psychopath to a female empathetic person, simply because that's the way in which the psychologist wanted to study it, right? And she laid out some really intriguing anatomical truths about sociopaths. First thing was, and I believe it was the amygdala and the thalamus, but parts of the brain in a sociopath and a psychopath are physically smaller than a normal person's brain. And this sheds light on why there's the missing empathy, compassion component. It's physically not available in the brain chemistry. That was one thing that was huge to me. Another thing is when she was laying out several dozens of case studies that she had changed the names for the people for their privacy, there were verbatim statements in each relationship said by the psychopath that's unique to that relationship, but the statements were always the same. And when I read these statements, I was shocked because I had been told these statements from the psychopath that I had just gotten out of a relationship with. I couldn't believe it because the experience in that statement was so personal to me, but it was generic. It was textbook in regard to that type of pathology. And through that book, I realized that even though as an empathic, compassionate person, these experiences are so unique to that individual, in general, if you're able to step back and objectively look at pathology in general, the way in which a psychopath and a sociopath will navigate a relationship down to the exact words that they say. It's a very generic textbook structure or landscape in which they will be implementing onto the relationship and the partner. And this just rocked my world because it was the first time on a core level, through knowing in every way, which way possible in my being, that I fully registered that I never would have been able to take that point of view because I just don't have that in my experience. But when I was able to see through their eyes or receive it from that landscape, then I could understand why certain things happened, why they were said or why they were done. And I could bring things to a close because now it made sense. Now my brain had a solution and an answer to the problem. Because your mind will always look to solve issues, right? We will always create a story around our emotions, our thoughts, and our beliefs in order to solve the problem at hand, regardless if that story that our mind has created is accurate or not. And this brings us around to belief systems. It's very important to understand that it's the mind's job and design to come up with a solution to the problem. So if we allow our mind to create the story that validates the solution to the emotions, the thoughts, and the beliefs, then it can come to a close with that problem. And very often that story is way off the track. So some examples of this in current experiences is I had a client today who is dealing with some very tumultuous experiences around self-berating and self-deprecation. Currently, she's having a lot of issues with trust in general. And I said to her, do you think that you can take this very intimate, unique, personal experience with trust and look at it as an actual physical fortress that you've created and erected, a compound that is a mechanism of protection that protects you from any outside danger or threats. And it's refortified. And when you're feeling more experiences of distrust, then you can know that whatever is in front of you is the perceived threat that soul fracture or that aspect is scared of. The reason in general in which it's built this mechanism of protection in the first place. But in order to identify this mechanism of protection, you're going to have to pull out of the personalizing of feeling that distrust and feeling really bad about it. You need to see that that is the very intricate, intelligent design that meets a need, albeit it may no longer be a primary need. But when it was erected, when it was engineered, it was the primary need was protection. And it was very efficient in that right. That mechanism worked very, very well. But now at this point, it's simply outdated. That need may no longer be primary. It may be secondary. Or even if it is primary, the mechanism itself needs updating. It's no longer efficient. It's now limiting as opposed to expanding. And if we can do that, if we can withdraw out of the personalization and see that that entire cluster of belief systems, which equal emotions and thoughts and stories, now clustered together to create the umbrella of a belief system, we can see that that's just what's in front of the issue. And when this gets triggered, that aspect is really feeling threatened. And what is triggering it? The actual key, which is in her case, distrust. The mechanism of protection for her hinges on distrust specifically, will always be the key to unlock the initial root issue of that aspect. So if you can trace back what I call reverse engineer, your first initial experience or your subconscious experiences around distrust, you will now unlock the root issue that needs to be healed through shadow work and all of these types of things. But while you're excavating this, if you're excavating to reveal the distrust in the first place, to get to the root, and you begin to experience self-berating, self-deprecation, being really hard on yourself, essentially you're compounding and piling more gunk and junk on top of what you're trying to excavate. So you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? And when you can understand that very simple strategy, simple doesn't mean that it's easy to implement, very different things. But the simple strategy of excavating the root issue, and if you pile back on junk of what you're trying to undig, you're creating more workload. If you ground that strategy into knowing you can be very logical, even amongst the emotional triggers and the personalization when it's happening. You can say, you know what? It's really easy for me. I'm very impulsed to feel worse about myself. But the reality is it's not logical because it's going to create more work. And my goal is to uproot this and heal myself. Therefore, I don't want more work. I want to make my effort easier. And that logic is going to quell your mind. It's found a solution. Here's the strategy. And when you quell your mind, it doesn't have to keep telling you the story of you're a bad person, or this is horrible, or you're weak, or you should be doing better. All of these things. It relaxes the process. Now, another way in which I want to give you an example of how it's important to have a different point of view is a much more lighthearted topic. And I had a session last week with a client who wanted to communicate with his dog, the beloved family dog that had recently crossed over. Now, I am currently offering 25% off all animal healings and communications because I really love connecting with the animals. That's on my website, worldpeaceprojects.global, if you want to take advantage of that discount. So the human parents are communicating to the dog who has crossed over, and the dog is relaying different information, and the dog communicates to the human mom that he's very proud of her for accomplishing a certain workload. The way in which he explains it is as such that that in her work environment, she has had some kind of accomplishment, something has been achieved, and he's aware of that and he wants to acknowledge it. Well, when she hears this, it doesn't resonate because from what I perceived she was processing, I'm not 100% because I didn't ask about it, but I wondered, is she applying this to literal job, to actual work, and then maybe some kind of a raise or accomplishment with bosses, which doesn't relate because maybe she doesn't have a typical job like that. And there is no actual accomplishments or raises or things that have happened that resonate with her in regard to this. And after the session, I wondered, did she process it that way? Because from the point of view of the dog, it just sees work. The dog sees effort made. And I'm aware they had explained, the husband had stated after I said that, well, there have been some work achievements made on our real estate front as we're selling a house and doing all of this. And she's been working diligently in that regard. But it wasn't traditional career work. And animals don't view life and interactions and engagements the same way humans do. Humans have a huge propensity to anthropomorphize or place human traits onto the animal themselves. But the reality is it's not the way they navigate. It's not the way they process. For example, ever since I've been communicating with animals consciously, which has now been 17 years, I've always known animals don't grasp names. You can train a pet to memorize its name because it's aware when you say that word, you're communicating to that pet. So it'll correlate that through training. But in the animal kingdom, in the nature kingdom, they don't utilize names. It's frequency. There's no need to label it in that way. The way in which things are recognized and identified is through frequential energy. So they don't need labels and identifiers. Therefore, when you go to communicate with an animal and you maybe ask them their name or ask the human's name, often they don't have a clue. Or you'll get something that isn't actually the name the humans have given them, because that's not a situation in which they engage in the norm. That's a human process. Another thing is concept of time. Animals have a very different concept of time. So when I go to explain to an animal that their human is out of town for a week, it's actually quite difficult for me to do because they don't have a concept of a week. So usually what I do is I have to show them clairvoyantly day, night, day, night, day, night. And I try to do that for 7 days, even though I know that that's going to be really vague, because are they going to memorize or count the 7? So I can kind of generally let them know their human will be gone for a little bit, but to give them exact timing doesn't really work because they don't process that way. So that was a fun thing that always helps me from point of view, and not even, of course, across the board when it comes to training an animal or being safe and taking care from threat of an animal. You need to understand the way in which that particular animal processes and responds to stimulus or other beings in order to get into their shoes and see what's coming next. Now, another way in which I want to relate this experience of point of view and mechanisms of protection is through the energetic environment currently. Now, I believe it was May 29 where we had a huge coronal mass ejection that is creating these solar flares. And we also had, as my student was telling me, radiation storms, which creates a tremendous amount of energetic load and neutrinos that affect our bodies significantly. And they affect the satellites. A lot of people had issues, Wi-Fi going down. When these types of things are happening, it can be so big that if it's a satellite heavy environment, then you could blow electronics, what have you. And humans often get really triggered and reactive to these solar radiation magnetic influences. Oftentimes what happens is there's so much energy that they're highly triggered in a very angry or reactive way. Now, 2 days ago on May 29 and or May 30, I communicated with, and I experienced this myself, but I didn't pop off, thank goodness, but I did feel myself pop off inside. I had a handful of people communicate with me how they had popped off or reacted in a very explosive way, which is not their norm, which is not their nature. It was really heightened, and there was no ability to calm themselves. They just got triggered and they attacked or verbally, yelled or argued or whatever it was in the situation. Now, we've got all of this geomagnetic energy going on, the solar storms and radiation. We also have the Mercury retrograde, the Saturn retrograde, etc. A lot more going on with astrology. So the environment, the energetic climate, last week and this week, especially this weekend, is really charged, right? Which makes it very important to have the ability to gain a different point of view around your own triggers and other people's triggers. Because if you can understand, first of all, there's so much electricity literally in the air right now that people are very susceptible to compulsive aggression and reactivity. Then that can help you detach from, if you experience that, or whether you're receiving it or you put it out there. You don't have to personalize it so much, because it's just a part of the way you're responding to the energetic charge, or they're responding. That can help give you a point of view that's more objective and assist in letting it go or finding a solution. You can also understand that as this is continuing to happen and it's ramping up right now and it's amplified when we have all of this energetic climate that's really charged, that the program itself that is already infesting different people, different animals, different consciousness, what have you, also ramps up. At that time, those people are more susceptible to the programming. And just like infections do, if you're also resonating, even momentarily, because their trigger triggers you, or on a more long-term basis, because you haven't done the shadow work around that specific trigger, and they come into your field and you resonate with that frequency, then you are now very susceptible and prone to that infestation. That infection now comes into your field, you contract it, it infests, gets under your skin literally, which is why we pop off and get so annoyed. It gets hooked into whatever zone in your bodies that you take it in and you're susceptible to. And now you have to work to eradicate the infestation, the infection that you've now taken on, right? But again, just as that client, or I don't know if I mentioned this client yet, I got an email from a client who was asking, how does he help himself when perceived attack comes at him? His propensity is not to take a defense stance, but actually retract. Then he lingers on the emotions after the fact because he's personalized this attack. So when we get infested, when we're not able to create our own energetic, emotional, sexual, mental, physical immunity around these infestations and infections, then now we have to work to heal and cure ourselves. And I always suggest a two-way street with this. Attack it and approach it from two ends here. So first, we've got the understanding of the point of view. Even if you get this after the fact, okay, you got hooked, you got triggered, it got you. But you still have the ability to register that, yeah, well, you're not surprised it got you because there's a massive energetic climate happening. You know, you're susceptible to that level of trigger, what have you, because that's how we learn. We always learn from repetition and after the fact. Next time, hopefully you get it while it's happening, just the way it goes. Don't add on and compound your load as you're trying to excavate this infestation. Don't beat yourself up that you got triggered and now you're infested, right? Let's be efficient here. So now, if you can approach this from two ends and say, first of all, I can go back to the root when this happened. Maybe the root is just the moment in which you reacted or responded to this experience, trigger, or person. Maybe you need to go even further back, depending on how deep-seated this issue is and how deeply you got infested. Maybe you need to trace that trigger back to when this has happened at an earlier point in your life or another timeline, or what's your karmic load, what have you. Where does your excavation actually find the root? Sometimes it's more shallow, sometimes it's deep. Remember that your mechanism of protection was the way in which you popped off, okay? So you might have activated anger, which I find is a false emotion. I've long thought this, and this was further validated when I overheard a statement repeated from some type of guru who said basically something to the effect that when you're experiencing anger, it means you're ignorant to something else. And that was a profound statement to me because I realized, because I already knew that anger, from my perspective, it's a false emotion. It's a mechanism of protection. It stands guard. It always protects something more vulnerable. It keeps up a big burly front to scare something else away so we don't find the weaker, more vulnerable, frail piece, right? Or at least what the anger deems as more vulnerable and frail. And so if I can recognize, if I'm feeling anger, I'm ignorant to something, else that I need to know, there's more responsibility I can take in order to help myself. So if you're popping off through anger, anger might not be the true mechanism of protection. Why did you get angry? What are you protecting through the anger? Behind that is often your key to the castle. What happened? Why did it upset you? What really got your goat? And you can trace that back to the root. That's one end of approach. The next will be more physiological, more energetic in regard to finding how you were hooked or infested within your bodies. If you have your ability to intuit and tune into your interoceptivity, which means being consciously aware of your internal processes of motion and movement in your body, if you have the ability to tune into your being, other way to say it is somatically access the anchor points. Where did the energy hook in? Are you feeling it in your gut? Are you feeling it in your heart? Are you now achy, and get behind that and start to energetically push that out while you're resolving the root and healing, doing your shadow work in whatever way you do it to fully eradicate this infestation, infiltration. And then you cleanse and clear and heal it. And now you've done the work. And now you can be very objective to see that's the design of the program, to trigger and pop off an impulse, you and them, and to get under your skin. It's a mechanism of protection from the program's point of view, right? So if we start to look at these different scenarios outside of ourselves, it can help us to understand our counter moves in order to assist and heal, and also relate to other beings. Like if we go back to the animals, now you can understand that level of consciousness in that species more thoroughly, which can help them feel more received and understood and loved. I hope that this was helpful for you guys. If you would like to have a one-on-one session with me, experience coaching courses or classes, my website is worldpeaceprojects.global. Please, please, please give me a like and a thumbs up. Share my videos. It would really help me out. I appreciate the payback karma. Hope you're great. Talk to you guys soon. Bye.